really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode. I have an announcement first. I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be teaching a workshop on surviving the aftermath of suicide in September. It will be Thursday, September 9th, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific time. It will last about 2 hours and it will be online over Zoom. And I hope you can join us. The tickets are $20 to attend, and I will leave a link in the notes for this episode where you can go if you're interested in registering and purchasing tickets for the events. I will also record it. So if for some reason you can't attend live, you will receive the recording to be able to watch afterward. So I hope you'll join me that day for this very important conversation. We need to begin talking about suicide more openly and freely in our society. So this is my attempt to help foster some of those conversations. So today we're continuing our conversation on what the ego needs to learn. And in the previous 2 weeks, we've talked a bit about the ego. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, you may want to go back and hear them. But I have been reading from time to time from my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul. And I wanted to let you know you can purchase that book at any online booksellers, but also directly from me. I have it set up now so that you can buy the ebook from me. So all of the profits will go to me instead of to an intermediary. And in exchange, you can get a 30% discount if you enter the coupon code podcast. And that will tell me that you listened to the podcast. And that's how you knew about this special deal on the ebook. So there will be a link for that in the show notes also. We'll move on to today's content. And I've been talking last week and now this week about what the ego needs to learn. And I'm sharing with you 5 lessons that came from Richard who talked about these in a podcast I heard. But these are lessons that he taught at a men's retreat a number of years ago. And they really stood out to me. They resonate with some of the lessons, the 7 lessons that I've taught about, but I really like the language he uses. So hats off to Richard Rohr. And he himself admitted he got these lessons from other places. They're not really anything new. They're universal teachings really that come from the wisdom texts that we have available to us. But last week we talked about the lesson, Life is Hard. And the second lesson that we'll discuss today is You're Not That Important. And this is a challenging one for us to look at. I think particularly because generationally, I think we have really come to a place where, some people have talked about narcissism is the defining quality of our society, and believing that each one of us truly is important, seeing ourselves as the center of the universe. And that may be happening more and more for younger generations, partly because we raised our children on theories of how to build self-esteem and help children feel positive about themselves, and teaching them that everyone is special. And what may have happened is that we inadvertently ended up inflating the ego to believe that it's definitely the center of the universe. So this is a challenging message for the ego to hear, the message, you're not that important. But I want to just dissect it a little bit and look at the words, because it doesn't say you're not important at all. It says you're not that important. So the fact is that each one of us is important. But what this message is trying to do is to humble the ego a little bit and to break through the ego's notion that it is the center of the universe, the center of everything that happens, that the ego should have its way, that life should progress the way the ego wants, which is why the first lesson is offensive to the ego, that life is hard, because the ego doesn't believe life should be hard. Life for me should be easy. I don't deserve to have hard things happen. So the message, again, that follows, "You're not that important," is a real wake-up call in a way for the ego. And there are some corollaries that come from this, and we're going to talk about how we move on from this teaching to a higher spiritual truth. But the fact is, we really do have to start by humbling the ego a little bit here with this message, "You're not that important," because otherwise, every time we talk about being divine, being created as a unique being in the universe and being bestowed with divine qualities, the ego just latches a hold of all of that language and feeds on it in order to inflate its own self-importance once again. And what this lesson, "You're not that important," is trying to do is to help the ego recognize you are just a part of the whole. You're not more important than anyone else, and you have to learn how to play your role as part of the whole. And yes, you actually are an essential part of the whole. So is everyone else. But you are not the most important part of anything that's happening here. So if we look at our society and civilization really over time, mankind has gone through various stages of development of consciousness. And thousands of years ago, we were all tribal. Our societies were focused on the tribe and the good of the tribe. There wasn't really a sense of being an individual, having rights, or having my own preferences. Everyone was a member of the tribe, and to be part of the tribe, you have to go along with what the tribe wants. And so that is this tribal aspect of society that used to be really the highest level of development a long, long time ago. But around the time of the Enlightenment is when the idea, first of all, of reason, of man's ability to reason and to think rationally, that idea was birthed, and also the idea that mankind has certain rights and that individuals are entitled to certain things, that the individual has certain importance. And that's the next higher level of consciousness after tribalism, this idea of individualism. Each one of us has something special and unique about us that should be appreciated, and each one of us also has just as much right as anyone else to pursue happiness and to live a good life. So that comes about with the age of reason and the dawning of awareness of individuality, and that we are different from one another in many ways. So I'll mention it just now, but we're not going to go into it. The step after that level of recognizing the importance of the individual is the pluralistic stage, where we begin to recognize once again the importance of the whole. So we move beyond our focus on individualism into focusing once again on the whole and all of the collective, all of the people, all of the beings that we are part of here on the planet. And we care once again about the good of the whole, yet we still understand that we are unique individuals ourselves. So we don't give up our individuality. We just learn how to be part of the whole and to contribute to the whole and add what we can. But we recognize this message that we are not the center of the universe. We're part of this unique web of life, this unique network of life in the universe. And we contribute something very important, but we're not the center of it. So that is the next higher level of consciousness. But right now, our society is very much steeped in the individualistic level of society on the whole. If you look at most people out there, there's a lot of talk about rights and entitlement and being victims because someone else got something I didn't get or took something away from me, and everyone wanting to represent their own right to have what they need. And there's nothing wrong with that. The individualistic stage is a beautiful stage because it allows us to emerge as who we truly are and be our own unique selves and be creative in many ways. It's a beautiful stage. But particularly, it becomes beautiful when it can be merged into the pluralistic stage where we begin to see, as a unique individual, I contribute something important to the whole, and the whole matters as much as I matter. And so when we begin to see that even higher view, then our individualistic awareness takes its proper place. Before we open up to the ideas of the whole and the pluralistic way of looking at the world, our egos are more susceptible to hearing these messages about the individual and about being unique, and in becoming inflated with those ideas and focusing only on me, only on what am I getting, how am I feeling, what's happening for me in the world. So the importance of this lesson to recognize is that before we can take the higher view, the view even of the higher self, that we're all part of the whole and that we are unique creations, we do bring something to the table that no one else could offer. Before we can talk about those messages, we have to make sure the ego is in its proper place and make sure that we're not going to feed into the pathology of the ego in a way. And if you remember, the ego loves to judge and criticize and analyze. The ego is the source of our sense that we are separate from other people and not like other people. The ego tends to distance us from other people because it puts itself first. And this is all protective. The ego is just seeking survival and figuring out how to protect us from danger. So that's why the ego engages in these behaviors. But the whole point of spiritual growth is to develop our higher selves, our higher consciousness, to become guides for the ego, to help tame the ego and give guidance to the ego so the ego can behave more properly. So the ego left to itself tends to become inflated, tends to believe that whatever it wants or prefers is the right thing and the best thing. If you think about where we are as the human species on planet Earth, many of our most difficult problems stem from ego-driven behavior. So if humans are the center of the universe, when we believe that about ourselves, we're the center of everything and the most important beings on planet Earth, then we feel free to use the planet for our own ends, to take whatever we want, to use whatever we want without regard for the planet itself or for any of the other creatures that inhabit this planet. We are comfortable consuming without really thinking about it because we're the most important thing on earth. Everything is here just to support us in who we are, just to support our life, just to nourish us. Nothing else matters as much as we do. So we tend to just consume as much as we want and produce as much waste as we want, which is certainly a problem we're facing right now on our planet. We also believe we have a right to dominate others because me, as the center of the universe and the most important thing, I'm the person who's right. I'm the person whose ideas should be followed and believed, and anyone who doesn't think like I do is wrong. So our desire is to dominate others who think differently than we do. That's one of the worst sins of the ego, to believe that it's better and more important than anyone else and therefore should have the power and should have the freedom and the right to dominate others. So this kind of thinking has led us to war and greed and corruption and materialism. That's what happens when the ego is in charge. And for humankind on planet Earth, the ego is in charge, at least in much of Western society, I can say. And I don't want to judge or look at other societies that I'm not as familiar with, but in terms of Western society, this individualistic level where the ego dominates is the prevailing state of consciousness. So, teaching the ego you're not that important is one of the really necessary stages in moving from being ego driven, individualistic to more pluralistic, uh, guided by higher consciousness. It's one of the really important features. So, before we can even begin to look at the qualities of higher consciousness, we really have to train the ego. We have to humble the ego somewhat and put the ego in its proper place. And by saying to the ego, you're not that important, is a way of saying, look at the big picture. Look at this. You are just one drop in a vast ocean. You are just one speck of stardust in a universe made of infinite universes. That's all you are. You are not any more important than that. That's the first step of that teaching, the very first thing to understand. Once the ego gets it, and once the ego is humbled and is more open and receptive and able to hear higher guidance from the higher self, that's when you finish the statement. That's when you go on to explain. Yes, you are but a single drop in the entire ocean, but from the perspective of the soul, you are the entire ocean. You are an essential part of the entire ocean. And yes, you are just a bit of stardust in the universe, but as a soul, as a manifestation of the divine, you are an essential, unique, creative part of the universe. So we can come back to this expanded view of ourselves as a manifestation of the divine once the ego knows its place and isn't using that higher concept as a way to simply inflate itself and justify its bad behavior in the world. So I love that Richard Rohr taught this message, this lesson at his men's retreat, because sometimes we need to be hit over the head with it a little bit. We need to hear it straight out in uncompromising words. You're just not that important. And it's a little jarring, I think, to the ego at first to hear it. But if you really look at life, much of life is trying to get this message across to you. At least from what I've seen as a doctor, both in family medicine and hospice, over and over again, when people deal with injuries and illness, the message that's coming through to them is, you're not that important. You are not somehow some special being that's protected against any of these things happening to you. You're just like everyone else. You're just as susceptible to an injury or an illness or to disappointment or failure or having hard things happen in your life. You're just like everyone else. You're no more special than anyone. And life is going to be hard for you just as it is for everyone else, because it's meant to be. It's set up that way because that's what will allow you to grow. So all of these difficult lessons, I believe, are coming as challenges to the ego and its sense of self-importance to help humble the ego, to bring it down a few notches, and to help the ego recognize my place here is in support of higher consciousness. That's what I do here. I support higher consciousness. I'm the vehicle for higher consciousness in the world. And I'm part of it. Yes, I'm part of the ocean. I'm part of this vast universe. That's amazing. But I'm not the center, and I'm not the most important. So a really crucial message. And the other trick the ego plays on us is that the ego convinces us that we're not egocentric. This is quite an interesting little bit of magic that the ego plays, but some of us listening to this may immediately reject it and think, well, I don't need to hear that because I'm definitely not egocentric. I definitely am not driven by my ego. But it's important for each of us to be able to really look at our own behavior, our motivations, our hidden agendas in life, why we do and say the things that we do, why we pursue the things that we pursue, and be able to tease out the little threads of ego that run through them, because each one of us has an ego that we have had to train, that we have had to teach lessons to. And one of the foolish things is to believe that we're already done with all of those lessons. We've already done all this learning. I'm not ego-based at all. I don't need any of this. What part of you is saying that? That's the ego actually hiding behind your spirituality and your spiritual practice, to convince you that you don't need to work on the ego anymore, because every time you work on the ego ends up getting humbled a little bit more. And the ego's biggest fear is of losing control, also of losing life and losing its existence. And the reality is the ego per se will not survive our death. Our higher self will, our higher consciousness will, but the ego is part of our unique identity in human form that will not carry on after we die. So the ego has to come to terms with that as well. When we fear death, it's the ego that fears death. And it's important for us to recognize every little tiny place the ego has an influence over our lives, because we need to work on it. Otherwise, we might be harboring hidden fears, hidden tainted desires, hidden motivations. We might be causing damage to other people in the world because we simply don't recognize ego where it is present. So it's a really good practice to spend some time noticing your own ego, and where are the times when you may feel entitled, when you may feel, hey, I don't deserve this. I shouldn't be treated this way. Hey, I shouldn't be excluded from the line at the store because there are too many people in the store. I should be able to go in. I just want to buy a few things. You'll be able to spot it wherever it is, that little voice of the ego saying, that's not fair. You deserve better than that. No one should be treating you like that. You're entitled to this. Every time you hear a voice that blames someone else or says, it's someone else's fault, you didn't do anything wrong, that person did something wrong, that's the ego speaking in the background. And when you can become aware of it, first of all, as I've talked in the last 2 episodes, we're not trying to get rid of the ego at all. We're simply trying to educate the ego and train the ego to become an ally and a helper of our higher consciousness. It's just that the ego has a lot of learning to do. And so we have compassion for our own ego when it shows up. Sometimes I find myself kind of laughing at the ways my ego thinks it's fooling me or hiding when I discover it and I can see it there. And I have to laugh a little bit, but I have compassion. I don't hate my ego. I don't want to kill my ego or destroy it. I want to be able to use my ego as my vehicle in the world to support the work I do and to help me be stronger and be a stronger voice and a stronger channel for my higher consciousness. So once again, the message is you're not that important. And it's not saying that you're not important. It's saying you're just not that important. You're not the center of the universe. So you might walk around for a while, maybe put that message up on your mirror on a little sticky note, because for one thing right now, we have lots and lots of self-esteem building messages and memes out there in our society. And those are all great because we do need to love ourselves and we do need to heal our wounded image of ourselves. But while we're working on that, we need to make sure that we keep the ego in balance so that we don't feed the ego with messages that it will misuse. So just a little reminder every now and then, first of all, life is hard. It really is. And you're not that important. I think that's a good little reality check for us on a day-to-day basis, is to stop and think. I go through it all the time. Why didn't that person answer my email? Oh, well, you're not that important. Like, oh yeah, that's true. That's true. People have other things going on. I'm not that important. It's okay. And it can be helpful. It can be helpful to get you out of situations when you find yourself feeling hurt and blaming someone else, and you just need to reframe it and look at it. This reminder, oh, wait, I'm not that important. And this issue isn't that important either. Let it go. It's not that big a deal. So remember, life is hard, and you're not that important. You are important. You're essential. And you're going to get that message loud and clear through this podcast, that you are bringing something unique to the world that the world needs from you. But from the ego perspective, it's not going to come. It's not your ego that's going to bring that to the world by itself. It's only your educated and trained ego that knows how to be an ally for your higher consciousness. So just a reminder, when you feel yourself going off into a state of victimhood or blame towards someone else, is to just stop and say, wait, I'm not that important. You are important ultimately, but you're not that important at this point. So I hope that's helpful to you. I loved that lesson, and it still challenges my ego every day. Every time I even read it on the piece of paper, it stops me for just a second, and I think, that's true. That's right. I'm just not that important. It's okay. It's all right. I can stop feeling like the world is mistreating me because I'm not important enough for that. So I hope it's helpful to you, and come back for the next few weeks. We're going to keep looking at these lessons the ego needs to learn, and doing some serious work on the ego here. If you want to work on this one, first, I would say write this down right now. You're not that important. On a sticky note, put it somewhere where you will see it, and then write about it in your journal. It's a great thing to journal on as you're looking at, what's hard about life each day. Stop and also ask yourself, you know what, I'm not that important. And how do things look differently if I stop thinking that I'm the center of the universe and I'm entitled for things to go the way I want it to? Then maybe what's hard about life doesn't look as hard. Maybe it doesn't look as negative or bad to me. Maybe I suddenly realize, like, oh yeah, I'm just like everyone else. Like, of course, life has its hard parts. That's just normal. That's what I'm going through right now. So come back next week for the next episode. Oh, sign up for the workshop on surviving the aftermath of suicide. I think we're going to cover some really good material there. And until next week, remember that love is what we're really here for. So face your fear, which is coming from your ego, by the way. Be ready for whatever happens next, and just love each and every moment of your precious life. Bye-bye.